Hello, and welcome to Functions in Python. The objectives of this video is to talk about what a function is. Once again, kind of review that. The hope is that you already know what a function is, but we'll review it one more time and how it relates to Python. We'll talk about how to define a function in Python, basically how to write a function in Python, how to call a function from different areas within your code. We'll talk about the order of functions in code. It's kind of different from what you might know already. And we'll talk about the return statement. All right, so nothing too hard. Let's kind of get started here. So once again, as you should know, a function is a block of organized reusable code that is used to perform a single related action, meaning one purpose. You should have gotten that again from your very first programming class, that every function should be of one purpose. But functions provide better modularity for your application and a high degree of code reusability, I should say. All right. In VB, in Visual Basic, probably one of your first programming languages, we called these procedures. So in VB, everything was a procedure, and a function was a procedure that returned a value. In Python, a function kind of does everything. There is no such thing as a procedure per se. Everything is a function. And so a function can be one that does something and doesn't return a value, or does something and can return a value. And you'll see that as we continue on and show you how to do these things. All right. The second paragraph here, a function is a block of code which only runs when it's called. You can pass data to it. It's known as parameters into a function. A function can also return data as a result. All right. So basically the same thing you've already known before. We can pass data into a function. That data that's received is called a parameter. The data that's actually called from the calling piece, the call, I should say, is called an argument. So one's an argument, one's a parameter. Sometimes people make those synonymous. They're actually different. One's an argument, that's what you pass, and what you receive is called a parameter. This to help clarify some terminology out there. All right, makes sense? In Python, a function is defined by using the def, D-E-F keyword, all lowercase. And as you can see here, a little example of one. Def, my function, and then open paren, close paren. Note the colons and note the indentation once again, okay? Print hello from a function. Everything that's within that function is indented. Hopefully you're getting the idea now that that's how Python works. Everything is indented. There is no end function, end sub, or anything like that. End if that you've seen before. Everything is based upon an indentation. If you have something that's, you have a function and you have a piece of code that's not indented, it will not be part of that function. All right, so deciphering this, let's see, function blocks begin with the keyword def, followed by the function name in parentheses, okay? Any input parameters or arguments should be placed within these parentheses. You can also define parameters inside the parentheses, meaning we can define them there also, something brand new. The first statement of a function can be optional, can be an optional statement. The documentation string of a function is, or doc string. The code block within every function starts with a colon and is indented. We talked about that before. The statement return exits a function, optionally passing back an expression to the caller. A return statement with no arguments is the same as return none. So we'll show you that here also. All right, so all this stuff's pretty simple. Take a look at this, make sure you understand each one of these pieces. But once again, I think it's better by looking at an example as we kind of get into this. All right, the following function takes a string as input, as an input parameter, and prints it on a standard screen. So here's a function that does this. We're going to do def, the good old print me, right? And we're going to receive str message. Str message is a parameter, all right? We're going to print str message, and then we return, all right? Based upon my testing of Python and going through it, the return is not necessary. It will return it as soon as it ends, but it's a nice thing to have in there, basically ending your function and what you're actually doing, okay? Once again, note the colon after the def statement, if you will, and the indentation. Once again, everything that's part of that function is indented within, or under, I should say, the def print me, okay? Once again, if you decided to have another piece of code and it wasn't indented, but you wanted it to be indented, but you forgot to do so, if it wasn't indented, it would not be part of that function. Okay, so it might, so it might be a debugging thing you might run into every once in a while that something's not working. Maybe you did not indent it correctly. Calling a function. Very simple. Defining a function gives it a name, specifies the parameters that are included in the function, and structures the block of code. We got that. That's what structure. Once the basic structure of a function is finalized, you can execute it by calling it from another function or directly. What I mean by directly, outside of a function. Okay, you can just do it in a piece of code that you're just calling functions from. All right, and you just do it by calling its name. There's no word like call or anything that you may have seen before. Just print me, and then the parameter that it's actually looking for. Okay, in this case, hello, I am here. All right, let's go back one more time. So if I sat back and called that function, the print me with that, it would take hello, I am here, right here, what it was called, right? And it would receive that into this piece right here, and it would print it. Note that we don't use something you might be used to. They're the by-val, by-ref, and also the data types. You don't need to define those in functions in Python. We'll talk about that in a subsequent video in regards to how data is passed in regards to by-val and by-ref in Python. It's a little bit different, but we'll talk about it. But in this case here, all you need to do is line up the parameters with the arguments correctly. All right. We'll talk about a little bit later on different ways of doing that. But for the most part, holding the same, rule true that you're used to already in programming, it should be a one-to-one correlation and in order. Okay, so if I had 2 or 3 parameters that I'm receiving, they should be in the exact same order with the exact same data types to make everything work correctly. Make sense? All right, so again, call on what you already know. This is slightly different, and in a lot of cases, a little bit easier. All right, go back through here. The order of functions in code. This is definitely different than maybe what you have been experiencing so far in some of your first programming languages. Remember when we talked about a programming language can either be interpreted or it can be compiled. If it's compiled, it goes through could be going through a major multi-pass type of compiler that goes through the code several times to make sure everything is there and what it's looking for. An interpretive language, on the other hand, really starts from the very beginning and goes through it one time. Okay, and it's interpreted prior to running the code. It does not require an executable. You just basically say run the .py file versus a .exe, which is usually the result of a compiler. Okay. With that, if you reference, so here's the things a little bit different. If you reference or call a procedure that has not been defined prior to the call, it will throw an error. Meaning this, if you sit back and you say you have a lot of code, say in your programs, okay, and you say you basically say print me, all right? But if you have not defined that function called print me before you actually call it, okay, it will throw an error. It'll say, I have no idea what you're talking about. This is true in C language, which is a compiled language, but it goes through the compiler one time. And that's why it's true there too. You must define all functions first before you actually call them, or it will not work. So to allow for calling a procedure prior to defining the procedure, I should say function here, like we do in Visual Studio, we need a multi-pass compiler. That's what Visual Studio has, a multi-pass compiler, where the first pass, it finds all the functions, and then it comes back through and says, okay, now I know what you're calling, I got it. However, that's not how it works in Python. All right, so all functions must be defined prior to when they are called. Not too hard. Just make sure when you're defining your functions, it's first in your code. No big deal. And then later on in your code, you can actually call them. Make sense? The return statement exits a function, optionally passing back an expression to the caller. Return statement with no arguments is the same as return none. So in this case here, I'm not returning anything back. However, what I can do, and you've seen this before, it actually treats it more like a function that you might be aware of, where I am passing a couple parameters, 10 and 20. Look at this right here, add total. I'm calling this function. See how it's defined prior to calling it. This is what I mean here. If I had this line up here, you would get an error. Does everybody understand that? I'm digressing a bit here because I didn't give you a good example when I was talking about in regards to order. If I call a function, it must be defined prior, written prior, okay, to when I actually call it, okay? Make sure we understand that. So in this case here, I'm calling add total. I'm passing 10 and 20 as my parameters. It's receiving it as number 1 and number 2. I got my total amount, and I'm going to return my total amount. In this case here, that return total amount will end up in the total variable sitting right here. Okay? Again, probably more, let's say, familiar to you as a normal function would be. In this case here, as you see, this is more of like what a procedure would look like, correct? So, but it's still called a function in Python. As a matter of fact, in most languages, C, Java, I don't, PHP, Python, and so on. Pretty much any kind of language that's derived from C, everything is called a function. Okay, you'll see that in JavaScript and so on. The only term procedure, anytime you hear the word procedure, is actually within the Visual Studio, I should say, the visual type languages, Visual Basic, C Sharp, and so on, that you actually build within Microsoft. That's the only time you hear that term procedure. Hopefully it doesn't confuse you. A procedure is really a function in most languages, but in Microsoft, a function is a procedure that returns a value. But in everything else, everything is called a function. Ah, I could keep talking, and probably I am confusing you, but no big deal. Make sure it's actually something that you understand. All right? So, not much different than other languages, a little bit of uniqueness. However, you'll find that Python is more consistent with the C languages and languages derived from C, such as Java and so on. All right. It has a little bit of difference to it in regards to how you define some things, like with the def and the indentation and so on. But all in all, hopefully nothing that that proves to be hard for anybody. All right. Now what we need to talk about is how do we pass those variables, and we'll do that in the next video.